First quarter. Dove again, the pick and roll. Oh! Derrick Favors! What a play! Defense explodes!
So today we have with us Ben Dowsett, and he writes for Forbes Sports, a guy who's covered the Jazz for some time, and I think a perfect person to bring on and to ask about Derrick Favors. So, Ben, how are you doing?
Doing very well, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, man. So I wanted to ask you, you're someone who's seen Favors play for a very long time. So just generally speaking, what are your thoughts on him?
Well, this is a guy who New Orleans fans who happen to be listening to this, you guys are getting both a great player and a great professional coming into your locker room there. Favors has been, I think, and I think a lot of people agree with me, both here in Utah and a few who have their ear to the ground around the league, that Favors has been a consistently underrated player. And frankly, part of the reason for that is understandable. For the last several years, he's had to play largely behind Rudy Gobert, who has emerged as an all-NBA caliber center, one of the best centers in the NBA, and the two-time defending defensive player of the year. So for that reason, and with the modernization of the game, Favors has tried on occasion to develop a three-point shot, but it has never really quite happened. So when you put that together, even despite his defensive versatility, which is really high, and we can get into that here at some point, he didn't necessarily fit next to Gobert as all the time, at least not seamlessly as an offensive threat, at least not in some people's minds, actually. The numbers tended to reflect that they did pretty well together, except in certain matchups. But for that reason, I think he's become really underrated as a player and what he can be as a starting center in this league, which whether New Orleans uses him precisely that way, whether he mixes up some time depending on which lineups he's in, I'm really excited to see him in that kind of a leading role from the center position. And then the other side of that is just the guy that you're getting in general in the locker room. Favors has made some pretty massive sacrifices in his time here in Utah, and he knows it. He knows that there were times where he was not going to get as much playing time. He wasn't going to get to close games in the fourth quarter because Rudy Gobert was out there, and the Jazz's most optimal lineups didn't contain Favors at that 4 spot. And he absolutely was perfect with that kind of stuff, both publicly and privately. He never complained. He understood what the role was. When the Jazz signed him, in fact, last year to the contract that he was on, which was a 1 year and then a second year fully non-guaranteed, which the guarantee date was July 6th this year, he signed that with the full understanding that the Jazz were going to use that flexibility and that they might move on from him exactly how they did here on July 1st. But he never complained about it. He signed the contract knowing what he was getting himself into and knowing that he wanted to stay in Utah and still be a part of it for the time being. The fact that they had to move on from him obviously is sad for folks here in Utah, but he's a fantastic guy and player who New Orleans is going to love.
Are you at all surprised at the actual trade that took place for him? I know you said that they kind of signed him with the understanding that he would be gone at some point, but given his skill level, do you think that he would have commanded more? Do you think it was a reasonable return? Where do you stand with all that?
Well, as far as the return goes, I think we should be clear that from the Jazz's perspective, this is not a trade meant to add value. I don't know if we actually have seen the precise picks. Apologies to your listeners if we haven't. I'm missing them. But I believe, from what I understand, they would be very highly protected second-round picks, which in essence often don't become anything. If you top 55 protect a second round pick, for instance, it's very unlikely that any pick will actually convey in that circumstance. The primary purpose here of this actually for the Jazz is getting Favors and helping him get to a place that he wanted to go. The Jazz had basically had 2 options for how they were going to move Favors' money once they moved to sign Bojan Bogdanovic away from Indiana, meaning that they needed that space. The first was just to waive him. As I mentioned, his guarantee date is on the 6th, but that opened up the risk of him actually being claimed on waivers, which was a legitimate concern. I spoke to several people around the league that thought there was a very real chance Favors would get claimed. And in that case, it might not have been somewhere he wanted to go. Might have been claimed by the Knicks. Pretty terrible organization, as we're seeing right now. Again, I don't know specifically whether Derrick wanted to go there or not, but that kind of thing was a possibility. Rather than do that, the Jazz, I had heard early on in the process that if Derrick was going to be released or they had to clear up that salary, that they would look to trade him in this type of a trade, basically a salary dump, where New Orleans is absorbing his entire salary, to allow him to, A, continue to make the same amount of money as he would have on his contract, which is a sizable amount of money, and B, to let him go somewhere that he's comfortable with going. So the Jazz actually did that mostly as a favor to Derrick.
As far as his timing, you kind of spoke to how he lost minutes because he wasn't a perfect fit with Gobert, which is completely understandable because I certainly project that he'll be a 5 over here now that he's cleared of that. What kind of minutes do you think that he's capable of playing? I mean, do you think he's a guy who can get 32 minutes a night as a center? Is he in shape for that? Is that something that he's built for? Or is he actually better in a role where he's getting 20, 25 minutes a night?
I think he's absolutely fit for a 30-plus minute a night role if that ends up being what New Orleans needs from him. He hasn't had to play that, of course, as we've talked about. He did average 28 a night in 17-18. If you go back to 14-15 and the year before that, he was over 30. And actually 15-16, he played 32 a night. That was kind of right as Gobert was kind of emerging as he was. So he's done that in the past, and he's talked specifically, openly actually, about how the fact that Utah didn't have quite the same starter role for him that many other teams would have, et cetera, has actually allowed him to preserve his body really well. He hasn't necessarily had to go through some of the rigors physically that a full-time starter at his position would have to. So from that perspective, and as far as what shape he's in, this guy's an absolute beast. Derrick Favors is a monster. He didn't even lift weights up until like his second year in the NBA, and he was still just shoving dudes aside. Yeah, he's an absolute physical specimen.
Yeah.
As far as conditioning in any areas like that, I've never seen the guy get tired on the court. I'm sure it could happen, but I haven't seen it happen. From that perspective, if New Orleans needs him for high minutes, I think he's absolutely there for it. But then, as we've seen in the last several years in Utah, if what they need him for is a little bit less than that, he's comfortable with that too.
I mean, so that's pretty exciting to me because it sort of, I guess my question for you would be, in my understanding of the Jazz is that they've always, at least for the most recent few years, they've played at a particularly slow pace. More of a defensive team. I mean, if this is going to be a run and gun team, which it certainly looks to be, I mean, you're saying that he's going to be in shape to get up and down the floor for 30 minutes a night. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I mean, remember that he's coming from a situation where he played half of his games every year at altitude here in Utah, which is, that adds to your conditioning. You're right. The Jazz didn't play as much of an up and down style, although there were times where they tried to emphasize that over the last couple of years. He's certainly not going to be the guy leading the break or anything like that, as I'm sure you knew, but there are plenty of guys over there in New Orleans who are great for that sort of a thing. And yeah, for me, he's not going to be trailing. And in fact, there's plenty of bigs who he's going to be able to out hustle and have more stamina than when it comes to that sort of a thing.
Is there anything else that we missed about Favors? I mean, defensively, can you talk about his impact? I know Utah for a few years now has been a really excellent defensive team. Obviously, a lot of that is also based on their perimeter players and Rudy Gobert being there. But, I mean, do you see Favors as a guy who can anchor a defense at 5? Does he have the requisite length? Does he have the requisite shot blocking? I mean, are those the things that do you think that he basically would fit into a rim protecting 5 role?
I definitely do. If you go and look at the second spectrum numbers from last year, Favors was one of the best rim protectors in the entire league. Now, there can be noise in those numbers, and it's definitely important to note that a reasonable percentage of those shots taken against him were while he was playing with bench units for the Jazz, and therefore maybe against more bench players and bench opponents. So we have to take them with a slight grain of salt. But he's shown really well in those metrics for several years. And beyond that, he's just a really versatile defender, frankly, more versatile than Rudy Gobert. I don't think I'm insulting Rudy by saying that. Derrick's ability to switch out on the perimeter, frankly, I mentioned earlier kind of his three-point shooting, which has never really come around, unfortunately, for Favors. Were it not for that, the Jazz would have been perfectly comfortable playing him at 4 constantly next to Rudy Gobert. The only issues were offensive. He didn't have any problems on defense chasing around smaller power forwards, stretch 4s, wings that are just playing at 4. He's fantastic switching onto smaller guards. He doesn't look like he has the foot speed to kind of close the gaps in certain cases, but he's really surprising once he gets moving. He's got really good change of direction for a guy as big as he is. His arms are longer than you expect them to be, kind of comes out of nowhere to get certain blocks. He's got a very different style as a defender than Gobert, but I absolutely think he's capable of anchoring a very good NBA defense, both from a rim protection standpoint and from the more modern sort of versatility that you need, and which I think New Orleans is probably going to do a lot of with guys like Zion and the personnel they have. A lot of switching and a lot of need for players like Favors who can check a smaller guy when they need to.
Okay, well, this you got me pretty excited. Is there anything that I missed about Favors that you want to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I think we hit most of it. I'll just repeat that that from a character and locker room standpoint, Derrick was always fantastic with me, everyone else here in the media. He just from that perspective, he's a really excellent guy, and I think he's going to just fit the culture perfectly. He's not super loud. He's a pretty quiet guy by nature, and I just think the sort of culture there that Griff is trying to build over there, which I know is one of professionalism and quality and class. I think Fave's going to fit right in with that.
Well, thank you so much, Ben. Go follow Ben at Ben_Dowsett, Dowsett. And thank you so much for your time, Ben.
Yeah, thank you.